Okay, so our next topic that we want to talk about is on administration and communication. Even though this is a short couple of pages in the standards, there's a lot of really good information to go over here. Lots of information that we'll kind of bounce around on too. We'll go ahead and just jump right on in there. Um, Now, on page 7, it talks about permit holder responsibilities. The permit holder is whoever owns your facility. So that could be an individual, it could be the church, it could be a corporation. Whoever owns your facility is considered the permit holder. Now, a lot of times directors will think, well, I'm the director, I'm not the permit holder, so this page doesn't apply to me. However, you'll notice that number 4, it says the permit holder will designate a director who basically makes all this happen. And so this page does apply to you, okay? One other thing that I want to kind of talk about starting right here is that, of course, you see throughout the minimum standards, you have weights over on the left side of the book. Everything is given a weight, whether it's a high risk, a medium high risk, a medium, a low. And that's what licensing uses whenever they basically evaluate your program and see how well you're doing. Obviously, if you get a lot of high risk deficiencies, that could place you on corrective action, probation with licensing, and you could get your license revoked if you have a lot of high risk deficiency. So you want to pay close attention to these items over here. Everything in this book is important. However, high risk deficiencies, you can actually get an administrative penalty for getting a high risk deficiency. Licensing can actually fine you money for getting high risk deficiencies. There are certain high risk deficiencies that are an immediate administrative penalty, such as loading and unloading children off of vehicles, anything related to infant sleep safety guidelines, and anything related to a criminal background check will get you an immediate administrative penalty. So while everything in this book is super important, pay close attention to anything that has a high risk, all right? The other thing that I want to point out is this date right here. And every single standard that we see in the book has a date right underneath it. That date is going to tell you the last time that particular standard was either updated or when it was adopted. Whether it's something that's brand new or something that in there changed. So obviously something in this particular standard changed in April of 2017. You'll see some really old dates in here too, like that one is a December 12. You'll even see some that go all the way back to, right here, September of 2003. Some of them are really, really old dates, but that just kind of tells you that standard's been around for a while. I point this out because I have people make comments to me all the time. Well, that must be a new standard. That must be something that's new. Oh, licensing just changed that. Well, let's take a look and see. Nope, that's been around since 2003. We see that quite often. Okay, so the very first thing under administration and communication is number 1, and this is a big one. Develop and implement your child care center's operating policies, which must comply with or exceed the minimum standards in this book. So, you always want to keep in mind that this book is exactly what it's called. This book is the bare minimum, all right? It's the bare minimum. You have every right to exceed everything in this book. And running a high quality program, which I know most of you do, or you plan to do, you should be exceeding everything in this book. Sometimes we have employees that come back and say, well, you can't ask me to do that. That's not what minimum standard says. Well, if whatever it is you're asking the employee to do, if it's exceeding this booklet, you have every right to do that. You know, I always use the example that I require pictorial schedules in all of my classrooms. I'm a really big believer in real life pictures, especially for our young children who cannot read, who have limited vocabulary. Real life pictures stimulates a different part of the brain. It's very effective. Well, nowhere in this book does it talk about visual schedules or pictorial schedules, but I mention it in my operating policies that I require this at every classroom. Well, I had a teacher one time who refused to put pictures up in her classroom and refused to put up a pictorial schedule. So I told her she had to do it or she couldn't work here. We ended up having to terminate her, and then she filed an employment saying that she was wrongfully terminated because nowhere in minimum standards does it say you have to have a pictorial schedule. I was able to respond to the unemployment claim and say, you're right, nowhere in this book does it mention a pictorial schedule. However, page 7, number 1 says I have a right to exceed. This was in my operating policies. You signed and acknowledged the operating policies. You needed to go away, and we won the unemployment claim. So this is a big one. And, you know, so as you're writing your policies, you want to keep that in mind. Number 2 talks about developing written personnel policies, including job descriptions, job responsibilities, and requirements. Again, this is a really big one. You know, I mention in our credentialing class quite often, the 2 most important documents that you have in your school are your personnel policies and your job descriptions. Those are 2 of your biggest legal documents. And so your personnel policies and your job descriptions have to be very thoroughly written to include everything that you want your employees to do, every expectation, and it needs to be clearly outlined on what you expect. Now, I don't expect you to have a book that's called operating policies and a book that's called personnel policies. You get to do this however you want in your world. In my world, I call these 2 documents parent handbook and employee handbook. And that works just fine as long as all the requirements are in there. Now, something else on number 2 where it talks about job responsibilities and requirements. You want to make sure that your job descriptions and job responsibilities are age specific. I think a lot of y'all would agree with me that the expectations of an infant teacher are completely different than the expectations of a pre-K teacher or a school-age caregiver. Those 2 jobs look totally different. So as you're writing your job descriptions and job responsibilities, you want to make them age specific, all right? And then what are the requirements for doing that job? Now, in minimum standards, when we get to our webinar on personnel, we'll talk about qualifications and requirements. You, again, have every right to exceed anything that's in this book. You just want to make sure you outline that here on this document, okay? Number 3 says that you make provisions for training. Okay, so you are responsible as the administrator for setting up the training for your staff. You cannot just say, hey teacher, you need to get 24 hours of training, go get it, all right? You can't do that. You have to make those provisions, and you should make those provisions. Remember in our webinar, when we talked about the Texas payday law, we talked about you are responsible for paying for the employee's time spent in meetings and trainings, and you're also responsible for paying for the cost of the training. That all comes from, boom, right there, making provisions for training. But since you're having to pay for all this, you need to make sure that you're getting a bang for your buck. You've got to make sure that when you're investing this money into your people, you're getting a return. You know, me as a trainer, it's one of my big pet peeves when people come to my class and they're just there to get their hours. You know, I don't want people coming to my trainings just to get their hours. I want people that are coming to my training so that they can learn, they can grow, they can make their program better for the children, they can make themselves a better person. You know, that's what I want. It's not about just getting your hours. It's about learning and growing. So when you're making, you know, accommodations and provisions as outlined on number 3, do it in a way that will benefit your people in your program. Don't do it just to get the hours. You know, I just had a situation last weekend in Austin at my weekend mini conference where, you know, 10 minutes into my session, I saw a lady on the very back row, all slumped down in her chair and had her phone out, just, you know, bloop, bloop, bloop through her phone, 10 minutes into my training. And so, you know, when we approached her, you know, she just made a comment, I'm just here for my hours. Well, go somewhere else to get your hours. All right. I want people that are willing to learn and to grow. You know, and I'm sure that this employee's director would not have been happy with her behavior or her comment back to us. You know, so that kind of leads me to my other point. When you do send your people for training, you need to be going with them, okay? So that you hear what they hear, you can hold them accountable for what they're learning, but also, you know, they act a little nicer when you're there. All right, and we'll talk about this a lot more when we get to professional development, the webinar on professional development. All right, number 4, like I said, designate a director who meets the minimum standard qualifications and has daily on-site responsibility of the program. Okay, so that's a big thing we want to look at right here, is the director must have daily on-site responsibility. What does that mean? Licensing is going to tell you that the director must be present enough to ensure compliance with the standards. So there's no set amount of time that the director has to be there, you know, but you do have to be there enough to ensure compliance. All right, so that's a tough one right there too. Now, it is going to tell you that if the director is out for an extended period of time, then you must have a director qualified person in place. An extended period of time is defined as more than 5 days. So you can still take a day off, you can still call in sick, you can still go to a training and be fine. But if you're going to be gone more than 5 days, that's when you're going to have a qualified person in place. All right, that's the general rule on that one. All right, reporting suspected abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Again, this is a big one. You know, we can do a complete 1-hour webinar just on this topic. And when you look through my online training library, there's definitely some topics just on this one that will cover all this material. Just really quickly though, I'm not going to go over, you know, how to look for a bruise, how to notice a mark, you know, what type of questions to ask children. That can all be found in my online training for recognizing and preventing child abuse and neglect. I want to talk just a little bit about the reporting guidelines, okay? Just real quick, a couple of things that you need to know. We are required to report suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation and sexual abuse. You cannot delegate the reporting responsibility. So whoever suspects the abuse has to be the one to report it, Okay, so if you have a teacher that comes to you and says, hey, I think Johnny's being abused, can you please call and report it? She can't do that. If she's the one that suspects, she has to be the one to report. Now, in a real life scenario, if you have a teacher that comes to you and says, hey, director, I think Johnny's being abused, you're probably going to ask, what's up? And she's probably going to say, he's got these marks on his arm. He made this comment, whatever it is, she's basing her suspicion on. You're then going to go look into the situation, look at it yourself, ask the child a few questions yourself, and then you might come back and say, you know what, teacher, you're right. I think Johnny's being abused. Well, now who else suspects the abuse? You do. So now you're required to also report. Now at that point, you could call and make the report on behalf of yourself and your employee. Okay, you're doing it for both. And you can either do this online or you can call the 1-800 number. The other thing about reporting is that you have to be able to prove your suspicion. And the way I define that is, can you write it down? A lot of times we have children or we have families that come into our program and just something in our gut tells us something's not right. Well, you cannot document a gut feeling, all right? So you can't report a gut feeling. It has to be something that you can write down. So are there marks? Are there bruises? Is there a behavior? Were there comments that were made? Whatever it may be, that stuff I can write down. I can prove my suspicion. All right. So that's what you want to look at on that one. Last thing I want to say about abuse and neglect reporting, just because you make the report does not give you the privilege to knowing the outcome. I hear this all the time from people. Well, I had this child in my program and I called and reported it and nothing was done. Well, you don't know that, okay? Just because a situation wasn't handled the way you would have liked for it to have been handled doesn't mean nothing was done, okay? And of course, if CPS goes out and investigates a family and imposes consequences on this family, whether it be parenting classes or visitations or home visits, they're probably not going to tell you because they're embarrassed, all right? So you're probably not going to know the outcome, nor are you privileged to that. All right, so again, lots and lots more that we could talk about on this one, but that's a whole nother class. All right, background checks. Anytime you perform a criminal background check on an employee, the results of the background check must be kept confidential. You need to immediately file these away. If you get a match letter on an employee, it needs to go immediately into that file. Now, I don't think you're going to go blabbing your mouth and telling everybody about someone's background history. What normally happens and what the intent behind number 6 is people leaving documents laying on desk. And you have a match letter, you leave it laying on your desk, someone else comes in your office, they see it. That's actually a Class A misdemeanor, all right? You leaving paper laying around, this information being exposed, you could have charges filed against you. So when you do those background checks, make sure all that stuff is kept extremely confidential. You're going to notice as we go through the book, these are called technical assistance boxes down here. They're not really standards or regulations. They're just helpful tips and additional information. These are actually really, really good. I encourage you to take the minimum standards book and just go through and read everything in the boxes. They're great stuff. But right here, this second bullet point is where it's going to talk to you about disclosure of confidential background check information as a Class A misdemeanor. All right. So you want to keep it separate right there. I also like to point out, and I love this tip, it says you may want to keep background check information in a location separate from other staff records. I love that suggestion. So you could have your employee file with all the state required information in it. You could also have a confidential file with all your payroll records and performance reviews and time off requests. I would keep a totally separate file just for background check information. That is kept under lock and key. Okay. This is huge because I don't want any of y'all going to jail over this one. Okay. I don't want any of y'all going to jail anyway, but this is one that, be careful. And especially with the high number of employees that we get match letters on these days, because you pretty much get a match letter on any and everything that they've ever done. There's a lot of them, and we've got to keep it under lock and key. Number 7 is going to talk about parents having the opportunity to visit your program at any time to observe their child, the program activities, the buildings or ground, without prior approval. So you have to have an open door policy. I just heard someone like 2 weeks ago make a comment, and she said, we do not allow parents in the building from 9:30 to 3 or something like that. Eek, that's not good. All right. You can't do that. You can limit when children are signed in, like we cut off, all of our children must be at the school by 9 a.m. Anyone that's going to be past 9 can't come for the day. That I can limit right there, but as far as telling parents when they can and cannot come in, you can't do that. Okay, you've got to have an open door policy. Looks like you're trying to hide something when you do that, and we don't want that. Number 8 is going to talk about your liability insurance. You are required to have at least $300,000 in liability insurance at your program. I encourage that you have a lot more, depending on the size of your program. $1 to $2 million in liability insurance is what I always recommend. $300,000 is just not a lot of money, and it doesn't really cost you that much more to increase that. Number 9 is where it's going to talk about the Texas Administrative Code. I mentioned that in another webinar, that this is not the only book that we follow. We also have to follow the Administrative Code. It's going to mention that right there. And you can pull that document right off of licensing's website, just like this book. 10 is going to talk about the Americans with Disability Act. One of our other trainings, we talked about all of the other federal, state, and local agencies that we have to keep happy. Licensing is not the only agency that we have to comply with their rules. There's tons of other people. The Americans with Disability Act is one of them. And in that training, if y'all remember, we talked about the Americans with Disability Act kind of is a double whammy for us. We have to comply with the Americans with Disability Act for our employees that we hire and also the children that we enroll. Years ago, there used to be a whole chapter of minimum standards just on number 10. They took all that out because it was redundant, all right? Number 10 tells you must comply with the Americans with Disability Act. There was no reason for a whole chapter on it, all right? And basically, because again, this is a whole nother, 2-hour webinar that we could do on this one. Probably not a bad idea for me to plan that. But you must accommodate individuals with a disability if you can afford to do so, is what the basic rule is. You have to be able to afford it. You have to be able to accommodate it. But the thing I want to keep you in mind is that if you have a child that comes into your program and they have a disability, can you care for that child in addition to all of the other children in the classroom? All right, that's what you've got to look at. If it's a child that needs one-on-one care or a small ratio, you may not be able to make those accommodations. All right, that's an individual case-by-case basis. All right. Number 11 is what is brand new that changed in April of 2017. And you must make sure that the total number of children in care at the center and away from the center do not exceed licensed capacity. So there have been times where people would take a large group of children on a field trip and then bring in more children at the center and exceed their licensed capacity. You can't do that. So you've got to make sure that you're looking at both. Okay, hopefully that's self-explanatory. All right, moving right along. Required notifications. Everything that you've got on page 8, number 301, you must notify licensing if any of the following change right here. I lost my train of thought, sorry. Any of the items listed on page 8 all directly relate to a chapter in this book, okay? So adding and reducing indoor or outdoor space, that's going to change your square footage of your building. Your capacity is based on the square footage of your building, both indoor and outdoor. So that's why you have to report that. Total number of toilets and sinks. Again, you must have one toilet, one sink for every 17 children in your program for children 18 months and up. So adding or reducing the number of toilets also changes your capacity. I've actually seen centers that have been cited by licensing because they had a toilet that was broken and they were waiting for a plumber to come and repair it, and it was taking too long for them to get it fixed. Well, that toilet being out of commission reduced their capacity and it wasn't reported to licensing. Obviously, swimming pools and bodies of water relates to swimming, the chapter on swimming pools, changing the age range of children, obvious right there. So great. Any new service that you're offering that's related to a chapter, you must notify licensing. If you go out of business, you get to notify them that you're out of business and they don't get to bother you anymore. Number 10 is something that was added in April of 2017. And that basically is saying if you have a change in ownership, okay, you must notify licensing because the new owner has to apply for a new license. You cannot transfer a license from one owner to another. If you sell your business, the new owner has to apply for a new license, okay? Even if you move your center from one building to another, a new application has to go in, okay? So you must notify licensing of those items. Same thing with governing body. If you have any type of change to your governing body, some of you may have a board of directors in your center, so that's what it's referring to right here. A change in your board would require notification to licensing. But most important, number 4 at the bottom of page 8, if the center director changes, you must notify licensing within 48 hours of a director change. Now, we mentioned in a previous topic that as the director, you are liable for everything that happens in your center. Whether you're there or not, whether you have knowledge of it or not, you're responsible for everything that goes on. If you by chance decide to leave your school that you're designated as the director, I would recommend that you personally call licensing to let them know that you're no longer there. I would not rely on the permit holder to do this. You don't want to be held liable for something that happens if you're no longer there. I just ran into a situation recently where a director was hired at a new facility. When the new facility went to designate her as a director, licensing came back and said, well, she's already designated at another school. Well, the school that she had worked at prior to this new school had never notified licensing that she was gone. And this had been about a month. And so they could not designate her at the new school until the old school took her off. Well, the scary thing about that is that that director was liable for anything that happened in that school that month that she was gone. So that's pretty scary. All right, so it's funny that I talk about this in all my classes, and then that just happened. I saw it myself at a center recently. All right, so page 9 is a big one right here, and this is going to talk about other situations that require notification to licensing. You must notify licensing if any of the following happens, and again, within 2 days. If your center becomes unsafe or unsanitary for a child. The big one is number 2, injury to a child in your care that requires treatment by a healthcare professional. Now, this is an interesting one. You are required to notify licensing if a child in your care is injured and that injury requires treatment by a healthcare professional. Okay, let's skip over to page 10 for just a moment. And on page 10, it talks about what emergency or medical situations must I notify parents. And it says, number 1, you must notify the parent immediately after a child is injured and the injury requires medical attention by a healthcare professional. So you'll notice that you must notify parents if the child requires medical attention. You must notify licensing if the child requires treatment. Do y'all see the difference in those 2 words? So that kind of leads to the next question. What's the difference between treatment and attention? All right. Here's basically what it comes down to. And I'm showing you these 2 pages for a reason. If this ever comes up in your world, I want you to be able to use these 2 pages. Attention by a healthcare professional means that the doctor examined the child. So you could take a child to the doctor, they're examined, the doctor says he's fine, you don't have to report that. Treatment is when the doctor does something to the child. So they stitch up the arm, they put a cast on the broken bone, they dig the rock out of the ear, they do an x-ray. That's all treatment. That all requires notification to licensing. All right. Now, here's a good rule of thumb. If you're ever in doubt, if you're ever sitting there scratching your head going, should I report this? What do you think? Do you think I should report this? If you're ever asking yourself, should I report this? Then I would report it. When in doubt, make the report. I would rather you report something that you didn't have to report than not report it and you should have reported it. Okay? So there you go on that one. Same thing with health department. If you have a child that has a reportable illness, you're required to not only report that to your health department, but also to licensing. Okay, now licensing is normally going to tell you to report it to the health department, and that's pretty much it. Okay, make sure that you have documentation from the healthcare professional that the child has been diagnosed with whatever it is he's been diagnosed with. Sometimes the parents will just come in and say, oh, my kid has chickenpox, or oh, my kid has whooping cough, or oh, my kid has the swine flu, and they really don't. The parent just went on to WebMD and self-diagnosed the child. When you call the health department, you start a big old circus. It's not fun to deal with. You want to make sure that you've got that documentation that the child really has been diagnosed with whatever it is that it is. If you run a criminal background check on an employee, and while that employee is working for you, they are arrested or convicted of a crime, arrested or charged with a crime, you also have to report that to licensing. Now, you have 48 hours to report this arrest to licensing. However, most of the time, you're probably going to get a phone call or an email from licensing first. They are really on top of this, and it's really fantastic. Once you do a criminal background check on an employee, they become tied to your permit number. When they go out on Saturday night and they get arrested, it's automatically going to trigger that computer that a person associated with your school just got arrested. You're going to get notified. All right, it's pretty cool. Now, if by chance you don't get that phone call, you have to report it to licensing within 48 hours. So you want to make sure that you put it in your employee handbook that if they get arrested or charged with a crime, they must report it to the director immediately because you have to report this to licensing. I personally have had a situation with an employee that got arrested for a DWI, and she was embarrassed, she was humiliated, she was scared to death that she was going to lose her job, so she didn't tell anyone about it, did not tell the director, did not tell me, did not tell any coworkers, and of course we got the notification from licensing. And so not only did we have to deal with the DWI, but we also had to deal with her failure to report as outlined in the employee handbook, which led to immediate termination. So really sad situation, but that's why you have it in your policies. Number 5, if you have a situation where a child is placed at risk, such as forgetting a child in a vehicle, leaving a child on the playground, a child wandering away from your program, or a child being left unsupervised. You must notify that to licensing, and you're in big time trouble. You're probably going to get cited for placing a child at risk and not following child staff ratios, and it's a mess right there. So let's do everything we can to keep these things from happening. This is why proper attendance tracking is important, being aware of the children, all of these type of things. I have a whole webinar just on safety and supervision that goes over nothing but basically number 5. We want to prevent that from happening. A controlling person, number 6, is a person that has decision-making authority. Okay, anyone that's got decision-making authority in your center, so owner, co-owner, spouse of an owner, board of director, regional director, those are all decision makers. They have to be disclosed to licensing on this controlling persons document, and that has to be turned in. So if you have any changes to that, you must notify licensing as well. Like I said, you have 48 hours to notify licensing of all of these situations. Nights and weekends do count. So if you have a child that gets injured on Thursday, you cannot wait until Monday to call. You would have to call within the 48 hours, which would be Saturday. Okay, that's where I see people get in trouble quite often. If a child dies in your program, you do not have 48 hours to report that. If a child dies in your program, you must notify licensing immediately. Okay. Now, please don't ever get the, oh, that's never going to happen to me mentality, because, bad things happen to good people. We don't want it to happen, but, it could. Now, the most common question that I get on 305B, What if the child dies at home? You know, there's an accident or a drowning or something at home. You only have to report it to licensing if the child is in your care whenever they pass. You know, it's sad. So, yes. All right, moving on. Emergency medical situations that you must notify parents. We talked about the medical needing treatment from a healthcare professional. Same thing, if they need to be excluded from care, you must notify the parents. And when you look at health practices, you'll see signs of exclusion. And I do recommend that you follow exactly what licensing has on exclusion from care. That way, if the parent ever gives you a hard time, you can just show them minimum standards. I do like to put a time frame on this. So put in your parent handbook that if a child is ever excluded from care, the parent must pick up within 1 hour is what I recommend. All right. Outline that. If a child has been placed at risk, again, you must notify the parent, just like with licensing. If your program becomes unsafe or unsanitary, you must notify the parent. It does say under 307A4, including severe weather. So for example, about 7 years ago, we had a tornado and hailstorm that damaged our building pretty bad. And it happened during the day while we had children in it. Now, everyone was safe, everyone was fine, but our building had quite a bit of damage. That was something reported to licensing, okay? Luckily, we were still able to operate, but we did have a lot of damage. All right, it does say under 307B on page 10 that less serious injuries you can notify the parent at pickup, and it says less serious injuries include minor cuts, scratches, bites from other children, and first aid. Even though it says you can report this to the parent at pickup time, I strongly encourage courtesy calls, all right? I'm sure a lot of you are parents, you have children of your own. None of us like to be blindsided, especially when you've been at work all day long, you're tired, you just want to pick up your bundle of joy and go home, and walking in and seeing their face mauled is going to be the icing on your cake, all right? So courtesy calls and heads up are a really good idea, all right? If you have, again, a communicable disease or a reportable illness, you must also report that to the parents of the children in that group. And then if you have an outbreak of lice, you must notify the parents in that group as well. All right. An outbreak of lice is typically defined as more than one. All right, or two or more situations. And of course, we want to notify so that they can properly treat that and get it under control. Page 10, required postings. I'm not going to go over real thoroughly. Just use this as a checklist. These are all items that you must post in a prominent area so that parents and employees and other visitors can see it. Make it look nice and pretty, and like I said, just use this as a checklist. I will tell you that number 3, the Keeping Children Safe poster, is your most commonly missed item. A lot of people just don't realize that this is a required posting, and so when you're redecorating and cleaning things up, it tends to go in the trash, and then boom, you get cited for it. Your activity plan, number 5, needs to be a current activity plan or lesson plan. So normally where I see number 5 cited is that it's outdated or it's an old one. Number 6 with your menu, where I see people normally cited for this is they make substitutions on their menu and they don't post the substitution. So if you are If it says you're going to serve corn today, but you're out of corn, so you sub it with green beans, you got to make sure that you post that substitution. 7, same thing, your parent notification poster. A lot of people don't realize that this is required and it goes in the trash. Both number 3 and number 7, you can pull right off of licensing's website. They print really nicely. Print it on cardstock, laminate it, make it look nice and pretty. Number 9, your current list of employees. Again, a lot of people, they just get behind. You have some turnover. You hire some new people. You lose some people. You got to make sure you're keeping your list updated. This one does crack me up because it does say it must be on an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. So they actually give you the paper size on that one. Number 10 is your list of food allergies. Now this one right here for your required postings, you just need to have a summary of all of your food allergies in the building. So you could say, currently at this time, we have the following food allergies. We have some strawberries, some egg whites, some peanuts, and whatever. Now, once we get to the food allergy emergency plan, the food allergy emergency plan is specific to each child, and that must include the child's name, what they're allergic to, signs and symptoms of a reaction, and what to do in the event of a reaction. That has to be posted wherever food is served and prepared, okay, for each child. So this list on page 11 is a little different because it's just a summary. Your food allergy emergency plan is in the classroom, in the cafeteria, in the kitchen, those areas. From time to time, licensing may tell us to post other items. So for example, y'all probably just got a big box of stuff about the flu that licensing told us to put out. A couple of years ago, we had some trifolds on infant sleep safety guidelines that we were required to put out. You know, anytime you get that from licensing, you're obviously going to follow those instructions. If you're ever placed on corrective action with licensing, they're going to give you a really ugly notice that you have to put on your front door saying that you're on probation or corrective action with licensing. That's not good for marketing and enrollment. We want to avoid that, but that would fall into number 11. All right. Must be posted in a prominent area. If you have more than one building, you may be required to post everything twice if parents only go into one of the 2 buildings. At the bottom of page 11 is going to be telephone numbers that must be posted next to every telephone in your building. This did change a little bit in April of 2017. You may want to make note of this 1-800 number for the Texas Abuse and Neglect Hotline. That number did change a little bit. And then you're going to notice up here the local licensing office and telephone number. I'm sorry, the local licensing office telephone number. We used to have to do address and telephone number of the local licensing office. You only have to do telephone number now. The reason for that is most licensing reps no longer have an office. They're mobile now, and so that's the reason why they took that off. All right. All right, operating policies. I'm going to try to get this done really quick in the short amount of time we have left. We might go over our hour limit just a little bit. Now, the next, couple of pages is going to give you the 27 policies that you are required to have per licensing. Now, in other trainings, I mention a lot of other policies that I recommend, but this is what is required. And what I recommend that you do when you write your parent handbook, the first 27 policies in your parent handbook are these 27 policies in this order, numbered exactly how they are on page 12 and page 13. That keeps it nice and clean. So when licensing comes in to review your records, there's no doubt that you have everything that you're supposed to have, Okay, you've got it. That's what I recommend. Now, most of these, again, are very self-explanatory. We don't need to talk about them. On number 2, release of children must be released to a biological parent. If a parent comes in and says, I don't want dad picking up today, you need a court order on file to prevent that from happening. We're going to talk about this in our webinar for record keeping. We're going to go into detail on that. Anyone authorized by the parent to pick up a child needs to be listed. Make sure that you're checking IDs. Make sure you have that in your policy, that if an authorized individual comes in without a picture ID or a valid ID, you're not going to release the child. Okay. You want to address all of that. You also want to address right here if a parent comes in to pick up their child and they're intoxicated or they're under the influence of an illegal drug, that your policy is to notify the local police department and that it will lead to dismissal of care. That's placing you at big time risk right there. All right. So lots needs to be included in number 2. Like I said, on number 3, your illness and exclusion criteria, just cut and paste exactly what licensing has. Again, I would just put a time frame on that. If you are dispensing medication, you need to put that in your policies, what that looks like. Medication needs to be in the original container, must be for that child, must be given exactly as prescribed. Parents cannot change the dosage. It has to be exactly as prescribed, cannot be expired, needs to be signed in daily, all right? All of that. If you may want to put some guidelines on this that, the way my policy reads is that we will only administer medication that is prescribed 3 or more times a day. So if a parent brings in medication that is given once a day or twice a day, the parent can easily do that at home. There is no reason for us to be giving that medication if they're only getting it once or twice a day. All right. Take the risk and liability off of your shoulders if you can. That's why my policy, 3 or more times a day, we'll give it that middle time and that's it. All right. I know a lot of programs that are just going to a no medication policy now. And if that's what you choose to do, that's what you choose to do. The only thing you need to be aware of on that one is that there are some medications that are protected under the Americans with Disability Act as a reasonable accommodation. So nebulizers and breathing machines, EpiPens, behavioral management drugs like Ritalin, children with diabetes and blood sugar testing. Those are all considered reasonable accommodations to a special need. You have to do those things. Refer to my online training, administering medications, for more information on all of that. All right. Your number 7, your discipline and guidance policy. You need to share that with parents because when they are on your property, they have to follow your discipline and guidance policies. So if they want to whoop their kid or they want to discipline their kid, they've got to do that at home, okay? When they're on your property, they have to follow your policy. So that's a big one right there, and I see people cited for number 7 often. Number 8 is brand new. As of April of 2017, you must have a policy on suspension and expulsion of children. Under what situations would you expel a child or suspend a child? Obviously, if the behavior of the child is placing other children at risk or placing themselves at risk, that could lead to expulsion. Of course, you want to have a generic clause in there that says you have a right to dismiss at any time for any reason, is definitely what's recommended. Look over here. Under your helpful information where it talks about a policy, on suspension and expulsion. It does even mention that the director may always retain the right to disenroll a child if it's in the best interest of the child or the other children. So even licensing recognizes that we reserve that right. A lot of times we have parents that get defensive and they're like, you can't de-enroll me, blah, 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 blah. Well, yes, we can. Okay. And I was very happy to see that this was put in the helpful information, kind of, backing us up on that. That was good. All right. Your infant sleep safety guidelines, just cut and paste right out of the standards. You just basically are informing parents that you follow the infant sleep safety guidelines. That one's pretty easy right there. On number 11 for immunizations, even though we are required to keep up with immunizations, I always like to put in the parent handbook that it is still the parent's responsibility to keep up with their child's immunizations. We still have to keep up with it. But that way, if you do run into a situation where you say, hey, mom, your child is past due on their immunizations, you have until Friday or they can't come back, the parent gets upset with you. Well, why didn't anyone tell me this until now? Well, it's still your responsibility to keep up with it. All right. Hearing and vision screening, you get to do this however works best for you. For your pre-kindergarten age children, they have to be screened for hearing and vision. You can either send the parent to the local healthcare professional and they can bring back documentation. You can bring someone into your program and you can have this done, whatever works best for you. I have found that the local Lions Club is a great resource. They will, a lot of them will come out and do this for free for us, and they actually do a really good job. Okay. 13 is one of my big ones under enrollment procedures. My policy is that all enrollment paperwork must be completed and turned in before the child starts, period. All right. And in fact, my policy says all enrollment paperwork must be turned in 3 days prior to the child starting so that you can get their files ready. You can notify the teacher. They can have their cubby ready. And it's not just mass chaos on Monday morning. I beg y'all to put a big focus on this one. There's nothing more annoying than getting a deficiency for missing paperwork. There should be no reason for that. And make sure that when you're giving a new parent a tour or you're going over your enrollment paperwork with them, that you stress to them that every single item must be completed. Do not leave anything blank. I'll even sarcastically say if I didn't need the information, I wouldn't ask for it, but it's on there, so I obviously need it. And I even have at the top of my enrollment form, do not leave anything blank. All right. I just had to explain to a parent last week that there's absolutely nothing on that enrollment form that is not applicable to you. Everything is applicable to you, but nice try. Pretty much half of the document she wrote an A on, and I had to give her a new form and ask her to try again. All right. You do have like your transportation, your water, your field trips. Those are if applicable, but if you're not doing these things, don't worry about them. If you are doing them, then you need permission for those, and then what are your policies on them? 18 is a brand new one. You've got to have a policy for applying insect repellent and sunscreen. If you're providing this, if parents are bringing it in, written permission to apply, that's what you want to go over right here. You need to have an open door policy so that you can discuss concerns, an opportunity for parents to participate in your program. Under the licensing report and inspection and how to contact licensing, that one's easy. Just get all their website information and put it in your handbook. All right. You do have to share on 23 your emergency preparedness plan, but don't share everything. Your secret code words and how you lock down your building and how you notify your teachers of a lockdown, that needs to stay discreet, because it might be the parent that is upset and acting crazy that you have to lock down your building, okay? So you do need to share your plan, but all of those little bitty details still need to stay private. Under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, you must provide parents a comfortable place to breastfeed or to pump their breast milk. Even if you don't have infants in your program, you still have to provide this area. You want to notify parents of child abuse and neglect reporting, as well as community resources and help for parents who may be struggling in this area. So some good resource material in your resource library will help you out with 25. If you're doing health checks whenever children are being brought into your program and your teachers are just visually scanning the kids, making sure that there's no bumps and bruises from the day before, let your parents know that you're doing that. I strongly encourage that you do this. Vaccine preventable diseases for your employees. You are required to review your program and do a risk assessment and then determine what vaccines you want your employees to have, if any. And that needs to be in your policies, okay? Also, again, they can visit at any time. You are required to have a gang-free zone. So any area within 1,000 feet of your school must be a gang-free area. You must notify parents of that. All right. So there you go. Make sure you share your operating policies with your parents. Make sure that you have them sign that they received their operating policies, that they read them, they've had the opportunity to ask questions, they understand them, and they agree to follow them, okay? So you want all 5 of those components in your acknowledgement form. I'll say it again. They received a copy of the handbook, they read the handbook, they had the opportunity to ask questions, they understand it, and they agree to follow it. If you have a parent that refuses to sign that acknowledgement, it's very simple. They don't get to come to your school. They get to go somewhere else. All right. So there is your chapter on administration and communication. So that was a lot of information that we just jam-packed in there. So